What up? It's September 3rd. This vlog that I'm doing right now is about like a couple of people that I left out in the last vlog that I just did a couple of days ago. I had forgot to mention them, so I'm just gonna do a whole. This video is just dedicated to them. It's a few. It's I'm gonna start with the earliest one. John Anthony. Not John Anthony. Anthony Johnson, and then John Casor, and then John Saffin, Samuel Sewall, and then another guy named John Punch, who was the very first black American to be given a sentence to where he'll have to serve life in servitude. I was gonna say slavery, but I'm gonna touch on why. You know what I'm saying? He's not the first to be enslaved based on definition itself. So those are the people that I forgot to bring up in the last vlog, so I'm just gonna bring them up in this one. I said I was gonna bring them up in the, during chapter 2, but I don't see how it's gonna be any relevance to that, because in the beginning of chapter 2, basically the Civil War has already started, you know what I'm saying? So everything is pretty much gonna continue from that point. So I'm like, it just makes sense just to do a whole separate video and bring them up during this video. But it does bring in something else to mind that's not related to the chapter, as far as like an additional relevance to all 4 of these key persons. This is about 2018 and 2019. I'm gonna shout out the Instagram page. Big shout out to Shorty, no offense, but I like old girl. She be having like a lot of good posts about health, you know what I'm saying, a little bit of religion, some history, just all kind of stuff, you know what I'm saying. Her name is the Black Swan. She's black and I believe Arab. She likes to say Asian, but ethnically speaking, she's Arab and black or whatnot. But I like her. Big shout outs to Shorty, by the way. I ain't being funny. But as far as like 2018 or 2019, I forget the exact year. I didn't go look it up. But she had a post that she put up on July the 4th. Again, between 2018 and 2019. But she was talking about her preferring June 10th over July 4th, and she got, vocal about, why she doesn't necessarily fall in line as far as like the symbolic meaning of the 4th of July, and how like the forefathers, kept blacks in slavery and all this type of stuff, which is cool. She gave her opinion. She was like, semi-scolding, but speaking honestly from her point of view. Long story short, and I put a little comment or whatever, then some other guy, I forget his name, he replied to the comment that I posted, and he was talking about like he said, and I believe it was John Casor, but he was saying like this is the first person that owned slaves in America, and they were black. So we went back and forth, and then we kind of snowballed to all kind of stuff, but that was like the essence of the discussion or whatever. But this brings me into mind because like the history of these 4 persons is very fucking relevant to that discussion that me and that guy had. He ended up blocking me, by the way. I believe he did, because I can't see his comments, you know what I'm saying? Like I documented the discussion because I thought it was a pretty good discussion, and then I put it on my Facebook page. But when I go back on to the original post from her, I don't see his, his posts, his responses to mine, because we went back and forth for a while, for a few hours, you know what I'm saying? But luckily I had documented that, but no disrespect to dude. I don't understand why he blocked me. We were just going back and forth. But anyway, that comes to my mind. I'm gonna speak on that further why in a second, but I want to go through the history and explain these persons. I'm gonna start off with Anthony Johnson first. You know what I'm saying? And by the way, when I was gonna bring them up in the first chapter that I just did, out of all of them, it was more so focusing on John Casor and Samuel Sewall. But it's, like I say, this is relevant. Anthony Johnson is just as relevant as the rest for this particular vlog. But anyway, I don't speak on him. Now, all of these persons, all of these black persons, they are from Africa. They're from Angola, right? So just for the sake of argument, I don't like to use this term because I think it's sort of racist, but just for the sake of argument, they would be quote unquote Negroid, not mulatto, not light skin, not any other quote unquote variation of blackness. They were quote-unquote Negroid. Or, to use Beyonce's words, even though like I'm still struggling with it in my head. And if I knew somebody, man, if I knew like one of her butlers or something, I'd be like, hey, ask old girl, you know, what exactly did she mean by that? I ain't trying to challenge it. I just want to know exactly where she's coming from. But I forget the name of the song. It could have been Lemonade. I don't know. I forget. But I remember when I heard the song, I heard she said, you mix that Negro with that Creole. You know what I'm saying? It was a decent song. I'm like, that's a little interesting way to look at it. A little interesting label. But anyway, just for the sake of arguments, I will reference that. They will be quote-unquote Negro or whatnot. Now, as far as Anthony Johnson, and I freaking hope I'm not saying his name incorrect, but yeah, Anthony Johnson, as far as him, he was born exactly in 1600. He was one of the first black people to come here to America. Again, him and others that were from Angola. The year that they actually first imported Africans here would be 1619. It was about like 20 of them, and all of them came from Angola as well. Now that is definitely true. That's not an exaggeration, because they have a name of one person, a lady by the name of Angela. By the way, these were not slaves. They were indentured servants. So anyway, he was born in 1600. He came here to America, to Virginia, to the colony of Virginia, in 1621. He was an indentured servant. He served for a little bit. When he finally ended his contract, you know, he got the promises of land, money or whatnot. He ended up becoming a very rich individual. I think at the peak of his life, he owned like 300 plus acres or whatnot. But as far as him, you know, he ended up getting enough wealth to where he owned 5 indentured servants. One of them for sure was black. It's a guy by the name of John Casor, the fella that I mentioned earlier, right? Another quote-unquote Negroid. But, dude, his contract was in, I forget exactly what year, but basically, like, when his contract ended, you know, Anthony Johnson tried to, you know, trick him into remaining in servitude or whatnot, so they ended up going to court for that. Long story short, John Casor won his case. Now, I thought that was pretty odd, because after he won his case, he later on served under somebody else in servitude. This guy, it was a white guy, his name was Robert Parker. This is why it's fucking weird. Anthony Johnson ended up suing Robert Parker. Now, this is exactly what the fuck I read. He ended up suing Robert Parker, and he gained John Casor back. And from that point onward, John Casor was ordered to serve in servitude for life. Again, literally, not a slave, just serving in servitude for life. Now, I'm like, how the fuck? Okay, if John Casor won that case, that means it's legitimate by the time he get, you know, work for the other guy or whatnot, Robert Parker. It's legitimate. How was Anthony Johnson able to put in a lawsuit and regain John Casor back in servitude for life, for whatever type of violations? They mentioned nothing like that. I thought that was quite odd, but that's exactly how the history goes and whatnot. So that's John Anthony. Well, I'm gonna go a little further and talk about the rest of his life. Why not? I want to say, like, later on after that, around 1657, you know, he had a neighbor, because he had moved somewhere else. I think by this point he had moved to Maryland, but he had a white neighbor, and I forget the first name of this neighbor, but his last name was Scarborough. This guy wrote like a fake letter claiming that, you know, Anthony Johnson owed him money or is in debt to him in some type of way, shape, or form. And then he forged that guy's signature. Now, as far as Anthony Johnson, he was illiterate, so he couldn't read. He really didn't contest it. That guy ended up winning the case or whatnot. And they wrongfully gave him 100, I think it was 150, 125 acres of land from Anthony Johnson. So it was a little bit of karma and payback for him, but I thought that was fucking down. That was a sign of racism even that far back then, because I thought it was, you know, it's obviously interesting that you have a black person that served in servitude or was an indentured servant for a certain period, get out, rightfully get his claim to, you know, some type of tract of land or whatnot, and then he worked that, became richer or whatnot. But you know, that's interesting that he had a fellow black person that under him later on as well, and even applied some of these little slick tactics to try to get him back in servitude, in which he ended up doing, which is, like I say, somewhat ethical, you could say, because I don't understand how legally he was able to sue to get John Casor back in the first place. So that was an interesting dynamic within a broader subcontext when you think about it from a racial standpoint. But later on, he ended up going through the same thing as well, by this white guy being able to just basically arbitrarily make a fucking claim and then get granted, win his case and get land after that. Now, even following this, because like I say, this happened in 1657, even following that, you know, and like I say, I don't know about what year exactly, because he died in 1730. You know what I'm saying? I mean, not 1730. That's John Casor I'm thinking about. John Casor was born in 1652 and died in 1630. But as far as like Anthony Johnson, a little later on, because he died in 1670, so I don't want to mix it up, but you know, he had a family or whatnot, and you know, like I say, he gained a certain amount of wealth. By the time he died, his wealth ended up being transferred over to a white person. They ended up in, you know, a little legal dispute, you could say, and I believe they said it was the Council of Virginia, but whatever higher authority at that time granted a white person as the heir to his, you know, accumulated wealth instead of his family. And a part of the reason at the time was because he was black, so he didn't have any type of rights. So he still ended up, you know what I'm saying, being done bogusly at the end as well. And also by some, you know, I think it was by 1730 as well. You know, his family history kind of disappeared from the annals of time as far as American history as well. So it was a lot that that could be said about that, but just to keep it simple, that's just him as far as his life. Now, the other guy who was actually the first person to be sentenced to serve a life under servitude was John Punch, or John Punch actually. Now, I don't know exactly when he was born, but as far as the circumstances of his life, that makes him interesting and relevant to that portion of history as well. As far as the 17th century is concerned, he was sentenced in 1641 exactly, and possibly July, but definitely 1641. Him and two other white guys, they had escaped where they was from. They attempted to go to Maryland as well. They all got caught, but as far as like the two white guys, they were given lesser sentences. So like they were just as far as like the original time that they had in servitude, that was extended pretty much. That's it. As far as John Punch himself, he ended up being sentenced to life in servitude. So that's the history with him. Now, Samuel Sewall, you know, I did mention him in the last vlog, but I didn't really go through the whole entirety of his story as well. Again, he was a judge in Massachusetts. He ended up, you know, trading opinions, you know, publishing opinions between himself and then another guy who was also a judge. His name was John Saffin. Now, he was, you know, purported to be racist, very aggressive, and he ended up in court quite a few times because of his personality, based on what I read or whatnot. He had somebody that was an indentured servant as well, a guy by the name of Adam, a black guy. Now, Adam was assigned from 1690, it was supposed to be 7 years, 1694 up until 1701. By the end of his term, John Saffin, you know, tried to have it extended until further notice, basically. So, you know, this is a little difficult too, because as far as the details they provided as I'm reading this on Wikipedia, of course, it was really similar to John Anthony and John Casor. It's like certain things didn't make sense. For example, this is how the story happens. John Saffin and this guy Samuel Sewall had been beefing even before 1701. They was going back and forth. As far as the document, the first published early, you know what I'm saying, public opinion against slavery, that was in 1700, right? It was called The Selling of Joseph. And that was from Samuel Sewall. And he was basically expressing his opinion against bondage of any type of people. But in that particular document, he was talking about black folks, slavery. He felt like it was morally backwards, and every human being deserved liberty or whatnot. What else? Yeah, that was pretty much the essence of this whole argument. And then no, it was I think it was something else. He said it was morally wrong to keep any persons in bondage. Of course, he referenced the Bible and Ethiopians and all that type of stuff, but the other guy, John Saffin, had published like 2 replies basically to him. Now this is 1700 when this was published. The other guy, Adam, the black guy, his contract wasn't up until 1701. But as far as what I read, you know what I'm saying, Wikipedia, of course, they didn't go into like what was happening during that whole episode leading up to the end of his contract, aside from a dispute as far as John Saffin trying to keep him bondage under that contract, trying to extend it. The only intimation that they provided, they was like, as far as like when they ended up in court, which is weird too, I'm gonna get on that in a second. As far as like when they ended up in court, they was like, a part of John Saffin's complaint was that this guy didn't serve quietly, luxuriously, like he was being funny with the language, but he was basically trying to say that this guy Adams actually was remissful in his duty. He didn't serve his duty, his contract to its completion. It was incomplete as far as like his work ethic itself. That's what he said. That was the intimation. But again, as far as like 1700 just being published and Adams being an inspiration for that, that means this dispute was going on even before 1701 when his contract ended, because they mentioned how Adams escaped from John Saffin's farm or whatnot in March the 1st of 1701. That's the year his contract was supposed to be over. But after that, after he escaped during that month, John Saffin and Samuel Sewall ended up at Sewall's residence, and they was arguing back and forth, and they came to the understanding that Adams' case would be heard in Bristol County in Massachusetts. Now, I'm thinking like, how the fuck, if he escaped already? I mean, they didn't say like whether he had they didn't say like when he got caught. That was the weird part. I was trying to get the back context to it, like trying to understand, like, okay, if he was at his house, but the man had escaped by this time, when did they catch him? Like, how can you come to an agreement with your adversary as far as these 2 judges and say, okay, yeah, his case will be heard in Bristol County, but if he escaped, I mean, they didn't catch him by that time, obviously, by the time both of them had that conversation. So on what grounds were you so sure that there was going to be a case if he escaped? Again, they didn't provide details as far as when did Adams get caught. And again, going further, they say the case started August 1st of that same year, 1701. Now, they went into a little background as far as John Saffin, which is kind of like, again, some shit's just not corroborating. They said like he had put in like he put in the word to try to be like a high judge within Virginia, right? Not Virginia, I'm tripping. He put in the word to be a high judge in Massachusetts, right? At the colony of Massachusetts. He eventually was granted, but they were saying like some judges would hear other cases from lower courts in tangent with these judges or something like that as well. And this guy, you know, he ended up being appointed as a judge of the high court, but he also tried to, like, he may have slicked in a juror for like the Adams case or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Again, they still didn't provide the background as far as like when did he get caught, etc. So the Adams case came up eventually, and it was heard in Bristol. Again, see all that background information that's missing, but whatever. It came up and it ended up in Bristol. He lost or whatnot. As far as Samuel Sewall, he appealed the case for John Adams. The case was sustained, and by 1703, I mean not John Adams, Adams. And by 1703, Adams had finally won the case because he actually was able to speak his side of the story. Therefore, he became free. Now, that's how that history happened. Now, going back to the original, like the person I brought up as far as the Black Swan Diaries from Instagram. And again, shout out to Shorty. I like her a lot. She has a lot of good posts. She got good content, basically, all around. And she's a ballerina. That's what I forgot to mention. But as far as on her post, that guy that I was going back and forth with, you know, the argument he was making, he was still wrong in a sense, you know what I'm saying? Because legally, like, none of these guys were slaves. You know, Anthony Johnson, John Casor, Adams himself, you know what I'm saying? I'm gonna hit it literally. Adams himself, even John Punch. None of these guys were slaves. They were indentured servants. Some of them, a couple of them, you know, ended up being sentenced for life under indentured servitude, but formally speaking, as far as codification and promulgation within a fucking law, they were not slaves. Slavery didn't become legal until 1661. That's when the law was put in place. You know what I mean? For a free person, a free black person as well, to because I don't think it was just like singly just for the purpose. I think that was like a general thing, but blacks obviously was included for a free person to own slaves. That wasn't until 1661. So legally, none of these guys before that, although there are circumstances, a couple of them, such as John Punch, for example, and John Casor, even though their circumstances were, you know, unfortunate, legally they still wasn't slaves. They were just serving a sentence for life. So you can almost call that imprisonment, not literal slavery. Again, that wasn't put into play as far as a law formally until 1661, and then the next year after that, in 1662, that's when, you know, it was also codified within Virginia. Yeah, within Virginia, the colony of Virginia, by the way, that whatever status that your mother had is the status that you're pretty much considered once you're born. So that's it, you know what I'm saying? So I thought that was relevant. By the way, shout out to that guy, you know what I'm saying? If you ever see this, unblock me or whatever. You can comment on this video as well. So that's the history with all four of those persons. Again, I didn't know how I was going to kind of tie them to chapter 2. I feel like I'd be going backwards and I wouldn't be able to make them relevant unless like something comes up to where I have to reference something in the past and then tie them to that. You know what I'm saying? I don't foresee how I'm going to be able to do that in part 2. So I decided to make this, you know, completely separate or whatever. So that's the history of all those persons. As far as like the population, I do know like in 1640 it was 150 black people. 1650 it was 300 blacks there. Then in 1680 it was about 3,000, and by 1704 there were, what was it? 1704, about 10,000 black people. Now again, one more thing as far as Anthony Johnson. Again, throughout his life he owned 5 persons. Just based off the language of what I read, even though some of it is incomplete, but that's fine. He owned 5 indentured persons. They never said 5 fucking slaves. You know what I'm saying? Because he died in 1670. So that law put in place 9 years before that's a possibility, but just factually speaking, based on what I read, he has 5 indentured servants. So again, that's about it. You know what I'm saying? Got that out the way. Now, as far as like chapter 2, yes, I'm gonna do thorough research on that one. That's the next one coming, because I'm gonna do this whole entire book, and again, get back to the other stuff such as Nestorius, the original, the origins of an Islamic state. You know what I'm saying? All kind of stuff, and then all the blogs even between. You know, as I get back to those blogs, 'cause I'm gonna start doing stuff simultaneously, just so I don't take too long to get some of this content out. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, in between that, man, I got a whole bunch of other